Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking a lot about prepping for tech interviews lately, and especially those at like the big name companies. And one thing that keeps coming up is this whole idea of learning a bunch of different coding languages. And I've heard from a lot of you that it can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, where do you even start? So that's why today we're going to dive into this article from Algocademy. It's called Why Knowing Multiple Languages Could Be a Disadvantage in Coding Education. And I think you're really going to find their perspective on this interesting, especially if you're aiming for those top-tier tech interviews. For those of you who haven't heard of Algocademy, they're this online platform that's known for its problem-solving approach to coding skills and interview prep. And their article basically throws out this idea that focusing on one language, at least initially, might actually be a smarter move for your coding journey. Now, I know that might sound a little counterintuitive. You're probably thinking, wouldn't more languages make me more versatile? More appealing to employers? Wouldn't it look better on my resume?
And trust me, I get it. I mean, there's definitely this pressure to learn multiple languages. You want to look like you can handle anything. And then there are those job descriptions that list like a zillion languages as requirements. Plus, there's always that fear that your main language is going to become obsolete. Like, what if everyone suddenly switches to something else? And then on top of all that, I think for a lot of us, there's just that pure intellectual curiosity. Like, we just want to conquer all the coding frontiers, but the article kind of challenges this whole mindset.
Yeah, I mean, those are all valid feelings for sure. But what's interesting is that they don't always reflect how things actually work. Like in the real world of tech, especially when it comes to learning and hiring.
So you're saying it's not just about collecting as many languages as possible on your resume.
Exactly. Like, especially for those really competitive interviews at the big tech companies, it's more about showing how you think, how you approach problems, than how many languages you can just like rattle off,
So it's less about being a coding polyglot and more about being like a problem-solving ninja.
Yeah, exactly. And the article dives into this concept of depth over breadth, which I think a lot of people struggle with. It's basically saying that mastering one language deeply is more valuable than having like a surface-level understanding of a bunch of them, especially when you're just starting out.
And they use the example of a binary search algorithm to illustrate this. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to make you write out the code for a binary search here.
Yeah.
The point is that the specific language you use is almost secondary to understanding the logic of the algorithm itself.
Right. Like, imagine you really understand the logic of a binary search in Python. Once you've got that down, adapting it to, say, Java or C++ becomes so much easier because you've already grasped the core concept.
So it's like you're building a house. You know the foundation is the most important part. And once you've got that solid, you can switch up the materials, the style. But that structure underneath is still going to be strong.
Exactly. And this whole depth over breadth idea, it applies to so many fundamental programming concepts, like data structures, algorithms, design patterns, all the building blocks of good coding. And it's just so much easier to build that strong foundation with one language first.
It's kind of like learning a musical instrument. If you tried to learn piano, guitar, and drums all at the same time when you were first starting out, you'd probably end up frustrated and not very good at any of them. But if you pick one instrument and really dive deep, then later on learning other instruments becomes easier because you understand those underlying musical principles.
That's such a good analogy. And, thinking about what you were saying before about feeling overwhelmed by all the different languages, the article actually calls this cognitive overload. And it can be a real roadblock to learning, especially in the beginning.
So it's like trying to juggle flaming torches while riding a unicycle.
Yeah.
Way too much going on at once.
Exactly. And to kind of illustrate this, they use a really practical example that you'll run into a lot when you're coding. How different languages handle null values. Basically, a null value represents the absence of data, but different languages deal with this in their own quirky ways.
Right. So if you're still trying to wrap your head around what a null value even is, having to learn 3 different ways to handle it is just going to make things more complicated.
Exactly. The whole point here is to reduce that mental friction, especially when you're just starting out. Focusing on one language lets you really internalize those core concepts without getting bogged down by all the language-specific quirks.
So it's like you can focus on learning the dance moves without having to worry about all the different costumes for each style.
Exactly. And this ties into another interesting point the article makes. They say that sticking to one language actually helps you develop what they call algorithmic thinking faster. which is super crucial for those tech interviews you're prepping for. They use the Fibonacci sequence as an example.
Oh, yeah, the Fibonacci sequence. I remember when I first learned about it, it was like this light bulb moment. It's not really about the specific code, but more about understanding the efficiency of different approaches to solving the same problem.
Right. And they found that the learners who stuck to one language were able to grasp this efficiency difference much quicker, whether they were using a recursive approach or a dynamic programming approach.
Wait, dynamic programming. Can you explain that one for me? I'm not sure I totally get what that means.
Of course. Dynamic programming is basically a way to optimize your code by breaking a problem down into smaller, overlapping subproblems and storing their solutions so that you avoid doing the same calculations over and over again. It's like having a cheat sheet for your code to make it run faster and more efficiently.
Oh, I see. So by sticking to one language, you can really focus on those problem-solving strategies without getting distracted by the syntax of other languages. It's like training for a marathon. You wouldn't switch your running shoes in the terrain you're running on every day, right?
Exactly. Consistency and focus are key, both in marathon training and in developing your coding skills. And speaking of those tech interviews you mentioned, I know you're worried about whether knowing multiple languages is a make or break factor.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of why I feel like I need to learn everything at once.
Well, here's where the article's perspective might really ease your mind. They say that technical interviews aren't actually about showing off how many languages you know. It's more about demonstrating how well you can think.
So it's less about being a coding dictionary and more about being like a coding storyteller. Being able to explain your thought process, your approach to solving problems, regardless of the specific language.
Exactly. And what's even more encouraging is that a lot of companies actually let you choose your preferred language. For the coding interview,
Really? That takes a lot of pressure off. So maybe this whole pressure to become a coding polyglot is kind of misplaced.
it might be. Yeah. They use another common interview question as an example, reversing a linked list. And the takeaway is that being really fluent in one language allows you to focus on clearly explaining your logic. You're not stumbling over syntax or getting tripped up by language-specific quirks.
So it's like being able to express your thoughts clearly in one language, rather than trying to fumble through a conversation in like 5 different languages at once.
Exactly. It's about showcasing your problem-solving skills and your communication, not just your knowledge of a specific language's syntax.
Wow, this is all super helpful. It's definitely making me rethink my whole approach. But I do have one more question. Does this mean I should never learn another language? Like, should I just commit to this one and never look back?
That's a great question, and it's actually something we're going to dive into deeper in the next part of our deep dive. It's not necessarily about never learning other languages, but more about being strategic about the timing. There are definitely times when knowing multiple languages becomes important, but those often come a bit later in your coding journey.
Okay, so it's like mastering one trade before opening a multi-service shop.
That's a great way to think about it. So stick around for part 2, where we'll explore when those situations might arise and how you can strategically expand your language repertoire later on down the road. For now, take a deep breath. Maybe grab your favorite coding language book. And remember, depth over breadth, my friend.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of coding languages and how focusing on one can actually help you in the long run. Before we get back to actually like choosing your one language, I think it's important to kind of step back for a minute and consider the mindset shift the article is suggesting. It's not just about picking a language. It's about approaching your whole coding journey with a different perspective.
Right. It's about recognizing that true mastery takes time, like whether it's coding or any skill, it takes time and focused effort.
Yeah, it's like those artisans who spend years perfecting their craft, honing their skills, paying attention to the smallest details.
Exactly. It's about resisting that urge to spread yourself too thin, to try to learn everything at once.
Which, let's be real, it's super tempting to do that, especially in tech. Like there's always something new and shiny coming out.
Right. But the article is really encouraging us to kind of consider a different path, choosing one language, one area of focus, and really immersing yourself in it.
It's like choosing to really explore one country in depth. Like savoring the culture, the history, all the nuances, rather than just like hopping from one tourist spot to another.
That's a great analogy because when you truly immerse yourself in something, you start to see those deeper connections, those underlying patterns that you might miss if you're just skimming the surface.
Right, and that's where real understanding comes from, right? It's not just about knowing the syntax. It's about internalizing the logic, the principles, like the why behind the what.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding is what makes you a more adaptable problem solver,
Yeah.
a more creative coder.
It's like learning a new spoken language.
Yeah.
Once you really grasp the grammar and structure of one, it becomes so much easier to pick up others.
Right, because you start to see the similarities, the ways that different languages express the same fundamental ideas, just in different ways.
Okay, so this idea of focusing on one language, it's about more than just learning the syntax. It's about building a foundation, a mental framework that you can then apply to other areas.
And that foundation is what will serve you well throughout your coding journey, no matter what specific languages you end up using.
I can definitely see how that would be reassuring for someone like me. Just starting out, feeling kind of lost in the sea of choices. But I have to admit, I'm still a little hung up on those job descriptions that list like a million required languages. It just makes me wonder if this whole focus on one thing is actually realistic, out there in the real world.
Yeah, I get that. It's a valid concern, and it's definitely something the article addresses.
Okay, good. Because I was starting to think this is all just a beautiful dream that would come crashing down as soon as I actually started applying for jobs.
Well, here's the thing. Job listings aren't always a perfect reflection of what's actually required for the role.
Oh, so it's like those online dating profiles.
Yeah.
Everyone's highlighting their best features.
Exactly. And when it comes to job descriptions, companies often kind of err on the side of listing every possible language or skill they might need, just in case.
So it's more of a wish list than an actual set of requirements.
A lot of times, yeah. And in many cases, those core skills, like problem solving, algorithmic thinking, strong fundamentals, those are way more important than knowing a specific set of languages.
Because you can learn a new language if you need to,
Right.
if you have those core skills down.
Exactly. And here's the other thing. Tech is constantly changing.
Tell me about it. It's like every day there's a new language popping up, new frameworks. It's hard to keep up.
Right. So trying to cram your brain full of every single language might not be the best use of your time and energy.
It's more about being adaptable, a quick learner, someone who can pick up new tools as they need them.
Exactly. It's about being a lifelong learner, embracing the fact that in this field, the learning never really stops.
Which is both exciting and kind of scary. But, speaking of learning, the article also talked about the role of platforms like Algo Academy in this whole depth over breadth approach. And I have to say, I've been using Algo Academy myself, and I really appreciate their focus on problem solving.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes platforms like that so valuable, especially if you're taking this approach of focusing on one language.
You mean because they provide that structured learning environment, those targeted challenges, that feedback loop that can really help you make progress?
Exactly. It's like a safe space to experiment, to make mistakes, to get feedback, and to gradually build up your skills.
It's like having a personal trainer for your coding muscles.
Love that analogy. And they often have a community aspect too, where you can connect with other learners, ask questions, share solutions, and, not feel so alone in the process.
Which honestly is a lifesaver when you're staring at a bug in your code at 3 a.m. and you feel like you're the only one in the world who's ever encountered this problem.
Oh, I've been there. We've all been there. And that's where having that supportive community, whether it's online or offline, can make all the difference.
Now, I know we talked in the last part about how this approach can actually help you in those tech interviews. Could you maybe elaborate on that a bit more? I'm still trying to wrap my head around how focusing on one language could make me a better interview candidate.
Sure. So remember how we talked about how companies often care more about your problem-solving abilities than your knowledge of specific languages?
Yes. That was a huge relief to hear.
Well, platforms like Algo Academy really help you hone those skills. They give you those bite-sized challenges, those opportunities to practice your algorithmic thinking, to optimize your code, to really think like a programmer.
And because I'm focusing on mastering one language, I can really dive deep into those techniques without getting distracted by the syntax of other languages.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding, that fluency in one language, will really shine through in your interview.
So it's like I can explain my thought process really clearly and concisely without stumbling over my words.
Exactly. It's about showcasing your ability to think critically, to break a problem down, and to communicate your solution effectively.
And being really comfortable in one language lets me focus on that, rather than worrying about whether I'm using the right syntax or whatever.
Exactly. It allows you to demonstrate your true potential, your problem-solving skills, without that added pressure of language juggling.
This is all so reassuring. It's definitely making me feel more confident about this approach. But I also want to acknowledge that this whole focus on one thing might not be for everyone. Like some people really love variety. They thrive on learning new things all the time. And they might actually feel kind of stifled by just focusing on one language.
Oh, absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to learning, whether it's coding or anything else.
It's about finding what works for you, what aligns with your learning style, your goals, your personality.
But for a lot of people, especially those who are just starting out or feeling overwhelmed by all the choices,
This approach can be a real game changer.
it can simplify the learning process, help you make progress faster, and lead to a deeper understanding and greater confidence.
And that confidence is what will empower you to tackle new challenges, learn new languages when you need to, and really thrive in this ever-changing world of tech.
So as you continue your coding journey, remember that it's okay to focus, to specialize, to go deep rather than broad.
It's okay to embrace the power of one.
And let that mastery be your foundation for a successful and fulfilling career in code.
Now, I know we've covered a lot in these first two parts,
Mm-hmm.
and you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds great, but how do I actually choose that one language to focus on?
That's a great question, and it's one we're going to dive into in the final part of our deep dive.
We'll explore some practical tips and considerations to help you make that decision. So stay tuned. And we'll help you navigate this exciting and sometimes overwhelming world of coding languages. All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of coding languages and how choosing one to focus on can really set you up for success. So I know this is the part you've been waiting for. It's time to actually choose that one language, to really dive deep into, I don't know, it's kind of like standing in front of a gelato counter with a million flavors.
Yeah, so many delicious choices. It can be tough to decide where to start.
Exactly. So how do you narrow it down?
Yeah.
How do you choose the language that's going to be your coding soulmate?
Well, the good news is there's no one right answer. It really depends on your goals, your interests, what kind of work you want to do.
Right. You mentioned wanting to break into tech, but you're still kind of exploring different paths. Maybe you're not even sure what kind of problems you want to solve with code yet.
Yeah, and that's totally fine. This is your journey. Exploring is part of the fun.
So let's think about it like planning an adventure. First things first. What are you passionate about? What gets you fired up? Like, what kind of impact do you want to make with your coding skills?
This is super important because that passion is going to be your fuel, especially when you hit those inevitable coding roadblocks.
Oh, I know those all too well. There will be times when you just want to chuck your laptop out the window.
We've all been there. But if you're working on something you're truly passionate about, something that excites you, you're way more likely to stick with it, push through those challenges, and come out the other side.
So picture yourself a few years down the line. What are you building? Are you creating beautiful websites that people love to use? Developing a game-changing app that everyone's talking about? Or maybe you're diving deep into data, uncovering hidden patterns that can help solve real-world problems.
Each of those paths kind of leads to a different corner of the coding world, and different languages thrive in those different areas.
Okay, so let's say you're really drawn to the idea of being a web developer.
Yeah.
You want to build those immersive online experiences, those beautifully designed websites that people just can't get enough of.
Well, in that case, languages like JavaScript, HTML, and CSS would be your starting point. Think of them as like the essential ingredients in your web development recipe.
They're basically the foundation of the web, right? HTML gives it the structure, CSS adds the style, the visual flair, and JavaScript brings the interactivity, makes everything come alive.
Exactly. And once you've got those down, you might branch out into back-end languages like Python, Ruby, or PHP to handle all the behind-the-scenes magic. That makes a website actually function.
It's like building a house. Those front-end languages create the facade, the beautiful part that everyone sees.
Yeah.
And then the back-end languages are like the plumbing, the electrical wiring, all the stuff that makes everything work behind the scenes.
I like that analogy. Now imagine a different scenario. You're a gamer at heart, and you've got this amazing idea for a mobile app that you know everyone's going to be obsessed with.
In that case, you'd probably want to check out languages like Swift for iOS development or Java and Kotlin for Android. Those are the languages that really speak mobile app.
Yeah, they provide all the tools and frameworks that make mobile development really efficient and, dare I say, fun.
Okay, so last scenario. You're a total data nerd. You love the idea of extracting meaning from massive data sets, making predictions, uncovering insights that nobody else has seen.
Then languages like Python and R are going to be your best friends. Think of them as your data crunching superheroes.
Yeah, they're definitely the go-to languages for data science, machine learning, all things data.
And remember, these are just a few examples. There are tons of other coding languages out there, each with their own quirks and strengths.
So don't be afraid to explore a bit. Read about different languages, maybe watch some tutorials, and see what really sparks your interest.
Yeah, it's like trying different foods. You won't know what you love until you taste it.
But as you're exploring, keep in mind that the job market plays a role too. Yeah, ultimately, you want to be able to use these skills to build a career.
Right. It's worth doing a little research to see which languages are in high demand in the areas you're most interested in.
Yeah, like checking out job websites, industry reports,
Yeah.
even just talking to people who are already working in those fields.
Exactly. And remember, tech is constantly changing. So being flexible and willing to learn new things will always be valuable.
It's like having a well-stocked toolbox. You might have your favorite hammer, but sometimes you're going to need a screwdriver,
Yeah.
or a wrench, or even a power drill.
And as your career progresses, you might find yourself adding more languages to your toolbox, expanding your skill set to match the needs of different projects.
Okay, so we've talked about passion, we've talked about the job market. The last piece of the puzzle is your learning style. Different languages kind of have different personalities.
Yeah, some are known for being really beginner-friendly, like they're welcoming you with open arms, while others are a bit more demanding, maybe even a little cryptic at times.
So as you're dipping your toes into different languages, pay attention to how they feel to you. Does the syntax make sense? Does the logic flow naturally? Or does it make your brain want to explode?
That last one might be a sign it's not a good fit, at least not at this stage in your journey.
But seriously, it's all about finding a language that clicks with how you learn best.
Like, if you love to dive in head first, experiment, learn by doing. A language like Python might be a good choice. It's known for being very beginner-friendly and pretty forgiving.
But if you're someone who thrives on structure, clear rules, guidelines, then maybe a language like Java or C++ would suit you better.
They're definitely a bit more demanding, but they also give you a really strong foundation in those core programming principles.
It's like choosing a workout routine.
Yep.
Some people love the free-flowing energy of yoga, while others really crave the structure and discipline of a boot camp.
The most important thing is to choose a language that you enjoy learning, one that makes you excited to code, to create, to solve problems.
Yeah, because when you're having fun, when you're genuinely engaged, the learning just becomes so much easier and more rewarding.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, remember, the choice is yours. There's no right or wrong answer. And it's totally okay to change your mind along the way.
The journey is just as important as the destination. Embrace the learning process.
Yeah.
Be curious. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
And whether you decide to master one language really deeply, or eventually branch out and learn a bunch of them, the real key to success is cultivating those core problem-solving skills, that algorithmic thinking that lets you break down any challenge into elegant, efficient solutions.
So go forth, code with passion, and build something amazing. That's all for this week's Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us, and happy coding.